Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world and whatever your time zone is, or whether you're listening to me morning or night. Lots and lots of love to you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. Go and get that lovely ice cold lemonade or a lovely hot cup of cocoa or tea or coffee, whatever it is you drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hugo and I'm from Georgia, which is a state in the southeastern part of the United States, bordering the Atlantic Ocean to the southeast and Carolina to the north and Alabama to the southwest. It's an exquisitely beautiful part of the world, consisting of ubiquitous farmland, imposing masterful mountains, rugged outcrops, flowery prairies, dreamy forests, silvery lakes, and so much more. I grew up in rural Georgia on a very petite farm that was situated in close proximity to a charming small town, which we would frequent regularly for shopping trips or for the occasional meal at our favourite hamburger joint. In those days, my father worked as a construction manager on a local building site in and around our area. Tucked in the middle of an undulating green valley, like a very large, cheerful sunflower, was our quaint family farmhouse that was flanked on its rear by a dreamy forest. The original colonial farmhouse had been in our family line for over a century and was sadly in such a state of disrepair that in 1976 it was bulldozed by my father and a new modern rustic-style farmhouse erected in its place. The new addition possessed large panelled wooden walls painted in a bright sunshine yellow, wooden exposed beams, along with a dark black slate roof. Then there were, of course, the eyes of the house, which were sizable white wooden French windows that overlooked the most panoramic exquisite views of the pristine verdant valley. There were 4 of us in my family, which included my brother Nick and my stay-at-home mother Lisa. We lived in close proximity to the town, which meant we could get there in 20 minutes and buy ourselves sweets and ice creams, which was a regular occurrence for 2 hungry boys. We also lived close to other small neighbouring farms, which meant we could interact regularly with the local kids, so life was pretty good for us. My brother Nick and I loved nothing more than playing in the woods together. It was such a spectacular secret place for us. It was like our quintessential enchanted secret kingdom, away from the prying, nosy eyes of our parents. It consisted of very tall, statuesque cedar, beech, yellowwood and chestnut trees, that were so very large that they towered up into the sky like masterful skyscrapers and provided a huge parasol above our heads, where pretty light twinkled through the curvaceous branches and leaves and delicately dappled the forest floor in a subtle ethereal luminescence. So many of the sculptural-looking trunks, branches and rocky boulders in this shaded sanctuary were resplendently swathed in glorious green velvety moss, and the underbrush or verdure consisted of lacy ferns, dogwood, lily of the valley, sorrel, bleeding hearts, and so much more. There was also an enchanting stream that zigzagged through the valley, where we would catch frogs or little fish with our nets as we paddled in the shallow water, for in those days all manner of moving things was a fascination to us boys. One thing I treasured about the forest was that it was always teeming and buzzing with activity from the charming indigenous woodland animals like the deer, the rabbits, the chipmunks and squirrels that were regularly seen scampering in the brush. My brother and I would play cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians together. I so fancied myself as a bold, brave Indian warrior called White Hawk, and I would wear bright, colourful war paint on my face. I also possessed my own fabulously glamorous Indian headdress made from real eagle's feathers, along with an Indian war buck shirt, decorated with ermine tails and hair, and exquisitely decorated with intricate bead and quilt work and matching suede fringe leggings, while my brother had a real black leather cowboy hat, black cowboy boots, and a large, highly ornate buckle belt with the emblem of an eagle upon it. We always felt like the real deal when we played our games together. Then there were less favourable times that my brother and I would experience an inauspicious uneasiness in the grove that we could not explain. And it would be times like this when the tranquil peace of the sylvan would suddenly dissipate, like the smoke from a chimney, to be replaced by a menacing, dark, oppressive, hostile ambience that would overcome us like the pressure of a boa constrictor, gradually squeezing the very life out of you. The bird song would just dissipate in a single instant, and everything would become airily still and very gloomy and repressive. We instinctively sensed we weren't alone and being watched by a pair of ferocious predatory eyes. We would discern the brush swaying and indenting inwards, as if seemingly being pressed down by a pair of unseen feet, but no one was physically there. In a trice the breeze would pick up its intensity and pace and would whistle and wail. We would hear these strange whispers as if something was calling out our names. If that wasn't discomposing enough for you, we were often assaulted by a barrage of stones that were hurled at us like flying bullets from a loaded gun, and this would be followed by the most menacing, foreboding screams that were so terrifying my hair would stand up on end and my blood would grow as cold as ice. It was creepy, sinister times like this that would mean that we would run back to the farmhouse in a total panic, and my mother would always reassure us. Forests are often portals for supernatural activity, she would tell us, so when the portal opens, make sure you leave the forest and only return when it's normal again. How do we know when the portal is open? I asked my mother. Well, it's very simple. When everything starts to get strange in the woods, you know that the portal is opened. That's when you need to leave and return. That's when the birds begin to stop singing. That's when everything becomes ominous. That's when you leave. You return when the birds begin to sing again. That's when you can play around in the woods to your heart's delight, because that's when the portal is closed. One day, as my brother and I were playing cowboys and Indians together in the woods, I suddenly sensed that I was being watched and studied and scrutinized, and icy chills travelled down my spine. And that was when I saw this demoniacal creature staring at me through a curtain of shrubbery. Whatever in God's name that it was, it appeared to be giant-like, covered in thick, dark black hair, with the most insidious evil eyes that I've ever seen. I was certain that a demon had entered the woods through the open portal. I shouted to my brother, "Run!" and this grotesquely ugly, duplicitous-looking beast thundered through the shrubbery like a rhino in the thicket and began to chase us. And every step it took, it seemed like the ground pounded and heaved under his sizable weight. I could smell the lingering, rank odour of his sulphurous breath behind me and feel its vaporous mist moisten my neck. I recall he snorted like a horse as he ran. Then the most appalling thing happened that is only made out of the stuff of your darkest, most traumatic nightmares. This hideously gross creature seized me with one of his colossal, human-like hands. I found myself being grasped in his chubby fingers like a soccer ball. For a moment, time stood painfully still, and this was the largest second of my entire life that seemed to last for an entire lifetime. I wanted to scream, but I could not, as my vocal cords seemed restrained, suppressed, or even paralysed by the sheer intensity of my fear. I could hear my brother's frantic cries as he screamed at the beast in an act of extraordinary courage. "Leave my brother alone! Leave my brother alone!" he shrieked, picking up a rock and throwing it at the critter, where it landed yards away from one of his huge, hairy feet. This valiant, heroic act of plucky courage on my brother's part was not received favourably by this macho creature, who clearly felt belittled and humiliated, and his anger was compounded. It was almost as though his ego had been bruised and battered by a silly little boy, and he was having none of that. The critter ground his teeth together angrily, and in an act of defiant rage, he lifted me up in his arms and was about to hurl me into the trunk of a large cedar tree, when all of a sudden he became distracted by the rumbling sound of rocks being displaced as something of ample size appeared to be racing towards us so incredibly fast that it sounded like a steam train on full throttle coming towards us. The next thing I knew was that this large grey beast that was of the same species as the monster, but of a gentle countenance and kindly disposition altogether, seized me out of the hands of the monster with an almighty tugging action, whereupon I was released from its grip. This grey creature gently placed me on the ground, almost as if I was a fragile china doll that could so easily break, while he began to launch a vicious attack upon the monster that had seized me. My brother and I raced back to the house as fast as we could, with our hearts thumping violently in our chests and our brows sweating profusely. We could hear the two critters growling and screaming behind us, and the ground groaned as they lashed out at each other like two boxers in a ring, clearly caught up in a heated, antagonistic brawl. My brother and I ran hurriedly into the kitchen, slamming the door behind us as fast as we could, and for a long while neither of us said a word, for we were so stunned, fixated and spaced out by the experience. I think we were suspended in a state of benumbed disbelief that seemed to anaesthetize our emotions. "I thought you were dead," said my brother, choking up with tears. "I thought I'd lost my best friend in the whole world." "I also thought I was a goner," I admitted to my brother. "You realise that that grey humanoid critter saved your life." "What are these things?" I asked my brother. "They look human, but they're not human. And they look like apes, but they're not apes. It's more like a mixture of both." "I wish I knew what they were," he said. "I have no idea." We decided not to tell my mother what had happened to us, as we didn't want to unduly alarm her. But that night the activity on our farm escalated when the vengeful beast that had chased us earlier on in the day came back to wreak his ultimate revenge and retribution upon us. I was awoken from a deep slumber at about 1 o'clock in the morning with a very unsettling, uneasy feeling that something was distinctly off. When I heard my father's rattled voice piping, "What the heck is going on?" I knew then that something was seriously wrong, and I had a sneaking suspicion that the menacious creature that had attacked me was now back. That was when we heard thumping and crashing sounds, as if something hefty and heavy was loitering on our rooftop and banging all the pipes. I knew at once who and what it was. My father immediately bolted out of the front door to see what was skulking around on our rooftop, making one hell of a raucous commotion. My dad quickly came scurrying back indoors, slamming the door behind him and frantically locking it. I discerned his face had become as white as a sheet, and his petrified wide eyes as round as saucers. He began to hyperventilate as his breathing escalated in a speed becoming so rapid that he could barely talk. "What did you see, Stephen?" said my mother, growing alarmed. "You're scaring me." My father continued to breathe fast, and then he said, "Monster. There's a monster on the roof." My mother began to laugh. "You are joking, Stephen." No, he's not," I piped. "This monster, Mum, it chased us today from the woods. And he's back again to wreak his revenge." "He nearly killed Hugo," said my brother. My mother's face became distraught and discomposed. "We must call the sheriff at once." "Are you kidding, Lisa?" said my father. "If we call the sheriff, he'll end up being seized and killed by the beast. I can't have that on my conscience, for the sheriff is no match for a creature like this. Have you seen the size of the thing? It's a ridiculous idea. I'm going to have to kill it myself with my high-caliber rifle." "How are you going to do that?" my mother piped. "Look at the state you're in. I doubt you're capable of firing at anything with a clear shot." "With a little Dutch courage, Lisa," said my father. "And I'll be good to go," he said, taking a few swigs of brandy and downing it like a fizzy can of Coca-Cola. We watched in absolute horror as my father cautiously slipped out of the front door, ensuring that the critter on the roof had not heard or seen him. My overwrought mother looked frantic, and her trembling hands were clutching her pale face as she stared at us with frightened, wide blue eyes. "Why is your father tackling the beast on his own? Has he got a death wish or something?" "Don't worry, Mum," I said. "Dad knows what he's doing." "I sincerely hope you're right, sweetheart," said my mother. All of a sudden we could hear a barrage of bullets being fired, followed by a shrill, agonising scream, and it was clear to me that my father had successfully hit the critter because you could hear the pain in his tortured, gut-wrenching outburst that clearly revealed he was badly hurt, which wasn't a good sign because an animal in pain can be an ever-increasing threat, and this critter was not going down without a fight. My father ran back into the house, bolting the door behind him, and he was so distraught that he was shaking like a jelly. "I got him in the hip," he said, "but my other bullets missed." We watched my dad with terrified eyes as he began reloading his rifle with trembling fingers. The next thing we knew was that our whole house began to feel like a house of cards as it shook and wobbled precariously, almost as if it was going to come tumbling down in any given moment, and my brother and I began to scream with terror at the top of our lungs, as the fear we felt was incomprehensible. We could hear this thing jumping off the roof and pounding and hitting our front door vigorously with such a mighty force, using his powerful muscular legs and feet to bash and whack it down. We watched in absolute trepidation as the wood weakened and began to crack, and splinters went flying everywhere, and through the cracks I could behold the black hairy silhouette of this noxious, loathsome monster. "He's coming after us," shrieked my mother. "He's going to kill us all!" My father was trembling violently as he kept his rifle pinned on the door, and we could see the door breaking apart, crumbling, and the critter barged into our house like a bull in a china shop, with a murderously savage look upon his face. His despicable actions were clear as he beelined directly towards my father, with his wide nostrils flaring, bespeckling the wooden panels of the floor with droplets of blood from his wound. He was foaming at the mouth like a rabid dog, and curling back his mean thin lips to reveal his oversized human-like teeth. All of a sudden, the critter seized my father's rifle in his monstrous hands, and bent it as if it was nothing, and threw it across the room and lunged towards my dad with his overlong arms. In a trice, as if by magic, the same creature that had rescued me earlier on in the day made a startling and welcome reappearance, and we watched in awe as this grey humanoid silvery form hurled its colossal body on top of the critter, pounced upon the monster like a lion upon its prey. We watched in a shocked silence as this grey creature began to beat and pummel the life out of the monster that had attacked us, aiming directly for the head with his powerful fists. In what seemed like only a few seconds, the critter that had tried to attack my father was finally lying there dead. And he lay there, this massive giant of black hair, limp and lifeless, with its eyes glazed over, and its mouth still hanging wide open. The grey creature straddled the dead monster by both of its legs, and dragged it through the broken front door, down the steps, over the undulating green turf, until it disappeared into the depths of the woods, and vanished from our sights. For a moment everything became so quiet in our home you could have heard a pin drop, as we tried to process what had just happened to us, and for a long while no one said anything, not even a single word. And then we suddenly began to hug each other and cry tears of relief and joy. We knew our lives had been spared, and whoever that mysterious grey wild creature was, it had saved our lives, but why he had come to our rescue, we may never really know the answer to that question. A few seconds later we heard what I can only describe as joyful, jubilant whooping all over the valley. And these rapturous cries of delight went on all night and continued for an entire week, and I'm not joking either. It would seem we weren't alone in our relief in the critter's demise, as other like-minded creatures like us were clearly delighted to see his end. At that time no one had ever heard of Bigfoot, so we ascertained that the creatures we had encountered were some kind of wild men with ape-like influences to their appearance. Both the creatures must have been about 8 foot tall, with barrel-shaped humanoid torsos and hefty Herculean-sized shoulders, with overlong arms and powerful, sturdy, sinewy legs. The grey wild man had long, flowing, silvery hair, while the one that attacked me had short tufts of dense, dark hair. They both possessed cone-shaped heads that folded into the shoulders in a smooth sweep, and we did not discern any neck to speak of. Not to say that there wasn't one, we just never saw it. It would seem that both critters had human-like faces, only their noses were very flat and wide, and their eyes deep-set and dark. Soon our lives returned to normal, and once again we were happily playing cowboys and Indians in the wood without incurring any trouble. One day when my brother and I were happily sitting by the stream throwing rocks in the water, I sensed that something was watching us, but it didn't feel menacing. We both turned around and saw the grey wild man that had saved our lives. He was looking at us with an inquisitive curiosity, and we were not even remotely afraid, as he had such a warm nature and a kind expression in his eyes. I got the distinct impression that he wanted us to see him as if he was trying to assure us that not all of his kind were like the odorous creature that had tried to harm us. I noted he had my Indian headdress in his hands and was stroking the feathers lovingly. I'd been missing my headdress for a long time, and the critter glided towards me boldly and placed it directly into my hands. And in that moment our eyes locked, and I could sense such a warmth in his eyes. I thanked him, and it was as if he understood, because he nodded his head, and then he walked away. He glided away with such a seamless grace, glancing back at us only a couple of times. After that event, my brother and I were never afraid in the woods again, as we knew the critter had our backs and was watching over us. I think he wanted us to feel assured. All these years later, I still live in my quaint little farmhouse that my father passed down to me, as I was the oldest male in the family. I live here with my wife and 3 kids, who are always playing in the woods. We only have a few brief sightings of the critters over the years, but they have been benign and benevolent towards us. I still have traces of blood spatter on the wood in my entrance hall, as an indelible reminder of how close we came to losing our lives that fateful night. With all the recent exposure of Bigfoot sightings in North America, I've come to the conclusion that much like people, Bigfoots can be good or bad. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what a fabulous story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.